So this week, instead of having Congressman LaTourette join us, we are ably replacing him with Matt Henkin, our legislative director here at McDonald Hopkins Government Strategies. Steve is unavailable today, so we didn't just pick the only other guy in the office with a beard. Matt has got a great amount of knowledge, particularly when it comes to the Senate and politics and a whole bunch of stuff. So we look forward to this conversation today.
I'm glad to be here.
So let's jump right into it. The big news this week is on the Affordable Care Act. We had two separate rulings. Conservatives got all excited after the first ruling, and then a couple hours later they weren't quite as excited. Two separate rulings, one saying that the federal subsidies and the federal exchanges were invalid, a separate Court of Appeals ruling saying actually they are valid. Why are these subsidies so important to the exchanges? Why are they so important to the ACA in general?
Sure. Well, I think it really all comes back to one of the central elements of the Affordable Care Act was the establishment of healthcare exchanges, which is done at a state level, where they bring in multiple insurers and citizens get to basically pick and choose which plan is best for them and their family. And if states don't establish their own, the federal government comes in and does it for them. And in the law, basically, a individual, a lower income family, is entitled to premium support subsidies to help them cover the costs of getting health care, which is required under the law. And Republicans, conservatives have pointed out that that subsidy is intended to go to the letter of the law only to individuals, quote, in states where the state has established their exchange. Now that brings into question, what about states that specifically did not establish that exchange and the federal government came in? One court, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, said that the letter of law says that it has to, those premium supports only go to states where they have actually established their own exchange. And that is great. For Republicans, not Republicans, anybody who's opposed to the Affordable Care Act, they would say if you take away those subsidies, it would actually get fewer people to actually get health care because they'd rather pay the penalty than buy the more expensive health care, which would then drive up the costs for everybody else's health policies, which would then result in an overall what they would consider a failure of Obamacare. So this was great. Conservatives are very happy. A lot of Republican senators, like Senator Cruz, Senator Hatch, they actually sent amicus briefs to this court in support of the plaintiffs that ultimately won that case. Meanwhile, you have the Fourth Circuit, which basically said that this is a very broad bill and that the language is very much open to interpretation, that therefore the IRS was acting consistent with the intent of Congress and the intent of the act. And then one more thing to really rain on the parade, I'm sorry to say it, but even the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, it was just a small subset of that court, and it is very likely that it'll get appealed to the larger Circuit Court of Appeals, which is 11 members, 7 are Democrats, 4 are Republicans. So I think the numbers game right there kind of indicates that even the favorable ruling might be overturned.
But it seems like we're on a crash course for the Supreme Court here. It seems like at the end of the day, as with previous provisions of the Affordable Care Act, this is going to get decided by the Supreme Court. When and if we get to that point, how critical is this provision? Essentially, if the Supreme Court were to step in and say, letter of the law says you want to know what, you can't provide subsidies except in cases where states have set up their own exchanges, does that fundamentally undermine the entire Affordable Care Act, or at least essentially does it?
If it ever got to that point and the Supreme Court ruled that the administration was acting outside of its authority under the bill, I think it would be a critical, I'd be very harmful to the bill, because ultimately it would result in higher premiums for most Americans and reduced enrollment, which is really those two items are really the purpose of the law. So I think I believe it's about 34 states that have the federal exchange instead of state exchanges. I think it'd be really harmful to the millions of individuals in those states that actually rely on those subsidies for their health care. So I think it would be a very harmful outcome for supporters of the law.
Well, we'll continue to watch that closely. The second big issue, which we've talked about here, Steve and I have talked about over the last couple of weeks, obviously, and everybody's seen it on their TVs at night, is the immigration crisis on our southern border. It has become clear that we have to do something. The president came forward with his plan, $3.7 billion. House Republicans said that they were going to rally together, come up with their own plan, which they trickled out a little bit last week and some more this week. It's being called the Granger Plan. It's a lot less money than what the president asked for, not surprisingly. We're talking about $1.5 billion, essentially. It's got some changes to a 2008 trafficking law that a lot of people have been talking about over the last couple of weeks. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on in both the House and the Senate, and are we going to get a resolution on this issue before members go home for August breaks?
Well, there's a lot to that question. I'd say, first of all, there is a surge of unaccompanied alien children coming across the southern border. There have been 60,000 this year alone. And there's a number of factors for it: drug cartels spreading misinformation to them about what they're entitled to in the United States if they go unaccompanied. All sorts of information that have really been drawing them up, as well as just the general fact that it's Central America right now is a very dangerous place to live. I think the president did ask for emergency spending, and just so everybody knows, when we had the Budget Control Act a few years ago, it set a cap of how much money the federal government can spend. That emergency spending would be on top of that cap. And traditionally, that's reserved for wartime spending, as well as disaster relief, like after Hurricane Sandy and after Hurricane Katrina. So this is a little bit different in that it's more of a human issue of immigration, which is itself very divisive. And as you mentioned, Chris, the president asked for $3.7 billion to basically address a number of issues related to the surveillance, detention facilities, health care, and other forms of care for the people that are detained by Homeland Security, as well as one thing is wildfire, which is actually kind of a pot sweetener. They're trying to get some additional funding for wildfire mitigation, which can be helpful for a lot of people in the Senate. So just yesterday, Senator Mikulski released her plan, which is about $3.6 billion, generally reflects what the president had proposed. In addition, it also provides some funding for Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, something that in the past couple weeks has really come to the forefront. And so that is another pot sweetener in the Senate. Meanwhile, in the House, they're really trying to make it less of an issue. So they don't include wildfire mitigation. They don't include the Israel Iron Dome, and they bring it down to about $1.5 billion to address some of those issues that the president had asked for. And in addition, they are also talking about mobilization of the National Guard to the southern border, which Governor Perry of Texas has already undertaken. And we'll see how that kind of unfolds. But it's divisive on both sides. It's divisive for the Republicans because they don't want to be seen politically as the just say no party. They do want to try to offer some solutions. And the Democrats are also very split on the issue of the trafficking law, which would actually expedite the repatriation of individuals from countries other than Mexico. And that itself is also very divisive.
Well, and it seems like there's been obviously a huge divide between what the Senate Democrats are wanting to do and what House Republicans are wanting to do. And that's not surprising.
Yeah.
That's how it is on almost everything. What I do think is a little more surprising is this is another case where there may not be the votes within the Republican caucus to actually pass the Granger Plan. I mean, since this has been floated out, we've seen a lot of hardcore R's saying, you want to know what? It's just simply too much money. It doesn't matter that it's roughly a third of what the president asked for. Yeah. It's still way too much money. Yeah. Do you think at the end of the day, with all of what people are seeing on TV, we're going to see something pass the House, the Senate, and get signed by the president before the August recess?
That is a very difficult question. I wish I could say that definitively. I think it is really tough. We have in August, Congress usually goes back to their districts and states, and they kind of also do a lot of political work back home as we approach a campaign season. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to that deal. I think there are a lot of people within, a lot of members of the Republican Party who are still really very ambivalent about whether this is an issue necessitating emergency spending. They also do see a lot of politics to it. They think that this is an issue where they can they can portray the president's executive order, which deferred removal of minor children who were brought to the United States, as an example of his failed immigration policy. So you have a lot of different factors involved, and I think at the end of the day, it's a crapshoot. I really can't say.
Well, wanted to close by talking a little politics. You mentioned that we're headed into an election season, and we've been in the middle of a busy primary season. And there's been a lot of focus over whether or not Democrats will be able to hold the Senate. And one of the potential pickups, one of the few that were on the board for Democrats, was potentially in Georgia, where they have a strong Democratic candidate, Michelle Nunn, daughter of popular long-term Senator Sam Nunn. And the hope was Republicans had a crazy free-for-all primary with lots of crazy people, and the hope was one of those crazy people would get through. Unfortunately, two of the not crazy people made it to the runoff, unfortunately for Democrats, two of the not crazy people. And then I started hearing Democrats talk about, well, if Jack Kingston, who's a member of Congress, longtime member of Congress, if he made it through, they could portray it as Michelle Nunn, the outsider, against Jack Kingston, part of the D.C. problem. Well, surprise, surprise, Kingston loses the runoff, despite being supported by basically everyone in the Georgia delegation, everyone that mattered. David Perdue wins the primary. Does this essentially take Georgia off the table for Democrats, or do you think Michelle Nunn is strong enough a candidate to still be competitive in November?
I actually don't think that in any way affects that. Georgia's still very competitive. Some recent polling has Michelle Nunn up a handful of points. I think it's going to come down to a very tight race either way. In 2008, Georgia was actually on the table as well for Democrats, and it went to a runoff then, and Senator Saxby Chambliss ended up winning in the runoff. But the Democrats think that they have a shot, and they ultimately need to. Of the 11 competitive seats, only 2 are held by Republicans right now. So that's really a favorable situation for the Republicans. They really have to be on the offense in Republican territory, and that's what Kentucky and Georgia bring. So I think that Georgia will be a very tight race, and I think Michelle Nunn is a good candidate, and but Democrats really if they're going to keep the Senate, they have to put some pressure in the Republican seats, draw some money into Republican territory, and that's what they're probably going to do.
Well, and you mentioned Kentucky. It's interesting that at a time when Democrats are facing so many vulnerable seats, I think it's interesting that 2 of the potential vulnerable Republican seats are in places you wouldn't think would ever be in play. One in Georgia, where Democrats haven't won a statewide office of any magnitude in over a decade, and in Kentucky, a place where President Obama is not very popular, a place where he lost, twice by large margins. And the incumbent Republican is the minority leader who's been here in Washington for a very, very long time. Do you think at the end of the day, if Democrats hold the Senate, they have to win at least one of those races, either Kentucky or Georgia?
They would. I think that they're going to have to win one or both of them. Otherwise, they really have to, sweep the table on the other competitive seats. And ultimately, it's 6 seats that the Republicans have to pick up, considering that Vice President Biden would be the deciding vote if it were 50-50. So, I go back and forth. Every week I see news that would be favorable to Democrats, and next week I see something that's favorable to Republicans. I think, generally speaking, the Democrats will probably lose seats, and how many? I don't know. That's for pundits to say.
Real quick parting question. You've got obviously a lot of experience with Colorado in particular. Yeah. That's one of the most closely watched races in the Senate this year, kind of developed very, very late with Cory Gardner getting in so late. Talk to us a little bit about what you think the state of play is in that race.
I think right now the race is very close. Recent polling has it within a couple points. Either way, Gardner up 2, Udall up 2, back and forth. You also have actually an interesting ballot initiative that deals with fracking and local control of fracking that actually might be bringing out voters with Colorado's energy sector, which would probably favor Congressman Gardner, because actually not one of the initiatives is not very popular. And so I think that it's hard to say. I think we said last time that initially Cory Gardner was in the race for healthcare purposes. That's really not been the issues much so in the past couple weeks. Now they're really talking about issues, economy, energy is a big one. And I think overall, I still believe that Mark Udall has proven that he can win statewide, which does make a really big difference. And it's going to be a tight race. I think Senator Udall is going to pull it out. And it's also another interesting thing to watch is the governor's race, which a month ago seemed like a no-brainer that Democrat John Hickenlooper would win. That's a bit more competitive now, which could put more resources into Colorado Republicans. So.
Well, it's going to be fun to watch over the next couple of months. Matt, thanks for joining us this
Glad
week.
to be here.